she could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes, yet none so piercing as his. The grand ballroom of Ashbourne House shimmered under the light of countless crystal chandeliers, each flame catching the gold leaf of the vaulted ceilings and casting a soft, trembling glow across the polished marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of roses, mingled with the faint tang of candle wax and the subtle, intoxicating perfume of women in silken gowns. Whispered conversations floated like drifting petals, each tone laced with curiosity, judgment, or envy. And in that sphere of gilded scrutiny, she stood, trembling, yet dignified, her gloved hands clutched at the folds of her ivory satin dress, a flimsy armor against the gathering storm of gossip. It began as a mere murmur, barely audible above the swell of the orchestra, yet it cut through her like the hiss of a serpent. "Did you see her at the entrance? The way she faltered before Lady Dunsworth's eyes, how unbecoming for one of her station." The words, sharpened by a venomous edge, rippled outward, gathering attention. Eyes darted, whispers quickened, and all at once, her reputation, the fragile edifice she had built with years of careful propriety, felt perilously close to crumbling. She lowered her gaze, willing herself not to betray the fear that fluttered within. Pride, she reminded herself, was a shield, and she would not let the careless cruelty of idle tongues strip it away. Yet, even as she stood poised with the precision of a trained debutante, a presence loomed at the edge of her consciousness. He observed her from across the room with the calm, measured interest of one accustomed to command. His figure was tall, sharply tailored in midnight blue, a duke by the look of his bearing, yet there was a subtle magnetism that drew the eyes of others as though they were unwittingly pulled into his orbit. And though he had not moved, nor offered a single word, the very air between them seemed charged, vibrating with a quiet, unspoken challenge. The moment crystallized with a minor catastrophe, a dropped fan, its delicate frame striking the floor with a muted click that somehow sounded like a drumbeat to the room. Gasps arose, some sympathetic, many critical, and the cruel whispering swelled. Her cheeks warmed, though she forced a serene composure. It was at that precise instant that he finally approached, not with grand flourish, but with the measured steps of a man who knows the power of his presence. Each stride drew a hush over a portion of the room, a subtle acknowledgement of authority, and she felt the curious twist of fascination and trepidation coil tight within her chest. When he reached her side, he did not speak at once. He merely inclined his head with polite recognition, and yet his dark eyes held her in a scrutiny so intimate that it was almost painful, as if he could see the very marrow of her thoughts and intentions. Her pulse quickened despite herself, each beat echoing the tension that swelled between them, a silent battle fought in a glance. "Miss," his voice was soft, deliberate, yet carried the weight of a command. "May I have the honor of escorting you to the next dance?" The question, courteous in form, dripped with an intensity that made her hesitate. She saw the faintest curve of a smile on his lips, the kind that promised both safety and peril, and understood that to accept, or decline, would mark her in ways more permanent than the whispers of the ballroom. A subtle storm of conflicting impulses surged through her, pride battling curiosity, fear entwined with desire. As her gloved hand hovered, suspended between refusal and acquiescence, a new wave of scandal erupted from the other end of the hall. Lady Dunsworth, with a tilt of her chin and a knowing glance, murmured audibly, "I suppose even the Duke finds amusement in daring company." The sting of her words burned hotter than the flush on her cheeks. All around, the room's attention returned to her, and yet, paradoxically, it was his gaze that anchored her, unyielding, deliberate, and inexplicably protective. She took a breath, her pulse still fluttering, and finally allowed her fingers to brush against his arm, a tentative contact, hesitant yet defiant in the face of whispered judgment. In that instant, the tumult of the ballroom faded, leaving only the fragile thread that connected her to him, taut with possibility and peril. And as the orchestra swelled into a waltz, she realized with a shiver that her life, once constrained by propriety and expectation, was poised on the precipice of something far more dangerous and intoxicating: the Duke and his singular, unreadable intent. In the glimmer of chandeliers and the quiet storm of unspoken words, she could sense it: her world had irrevocably shifted, and the game of society's scrutiny had only just begun. "A gift, sir? How dare you? Yet, how could I resist?" The morning after the ill-fated ball arrived with a soft drizzle that blurred the edges of London into a palette of grey and silver, the streets slick with rain and the muffled clatter of carriage wheels echoing between narrow alleys. Within the quietude of her drawing-room, scented with lavender and the faint smokiness of last night's candles, she opened the small parcel delivered without name or announcement. Her fingers trembled as they brushed the fine tissue, revealing a single, perfect rose, its crimson petals unmarred, nestled in a crystal vase etched with delicate arabesques. A note lay folded beneath, its ink flowing in a hand both deliberate and elegant. For the lady who carries herself with courage unseen by the many, may this remind you that the eyes which matter are not always those that watch with judgment. The words, at once daring and tender, sent a shiver through her spine. Who would send such a token, so intimate yet carefully measured? Only one mind she had encountered could command such audacity, the Duke. And yet, the very thought of his attention sent a dangerous thrill through her, mingling fascination with fear. Even as she contemplated the gift, a knock at the door heralded the arrival of the inevitable, Lady Dunsworth herself, dripping in silk and scandal, whose smile was sharpened with envy. "My dear," she cooed, voice honeyed with venom, "how fortunate you are that such admiration finds you. One might almost think the Duke inclined to favor you." Her eyes glimmered with a malicious spark, as if the mere suggestion might wound more than words could. She inclined her head, carefully neutral. "I assure you, Lady Dunsworth, I am most honored by any kindness shown." But the rival lady's whisper, like a knife hidden in velvet, was already drifting through the drawing room. "Did you hear about the rose? Sent by the Duke himself, no less. Can one imagine such impropriety?" The walls, so often a sanctuary, felt suddenly constricting. She felt herself shrinking within the confines of polite society, trapped between the thrill of attention from the Duke and the gnawing dread of whispers that could ruin her reputation. Every heartbeat seemed loud, an unrelenting drum in the quietude of her chamber. Days passed with a rhythm both maddening and tender. Each morning brought new tokens, handwritten notes, a small sketch of her silhouette framed in gilt, a delicate silk scarf left upon the windowsill. Each gesture, so intimate in thought yet public in rumor, became a battlefield. She was admired, envied, and quietly scorned in equal measure. And each time she held one of his gifts, she felt both emboldened and perilously exposed, as if the Duke's eyes lingered on her even in absence. At the same time, a new scandal arose. During a luncheon at the estate of Lady Bracknell, one of the Duke's acquaintances let slip with careless amusement, "I hear the Duke finds himself remarkably taken with our mysterious Lady of Ashbourne House." The words carried weight, more than mere observation, they were an accusation, whispered loud enough to set tongues wagging. Gasps and polite murmurs circulated, and though she kept her composure, her cheeks burned. The delicate web of society was tightening, and she sensed that every glance from her peers now bore the weight of scrutiny. Yet the Duke remained an enigma, present in each careful token, absent in the public eye, his influence both shield and dagger. When they met, even for fleeting moments, the tension between propriety and desire was palpable. In the corner of a library, she would find a note tucked within a book she had shown him weeks before. In the quiet of the conservatory, a single bloom waited for her upon the marble table, unspoken yet brimming with meaning. The duality of scandal and intimacy became an intoxicating, dangerous rhythm. Every whisper of disapproval heightened the thrill of his attention, every stolen smile or glance from him carried the weight of unspoken promises. And yet, the stakes were rising, each act of generosity, each subtle declaration, brought her closer to a precipice she could not yet name, where desire and duty, reputation and longing, would inevitably collide. By nightfall, as she placed the latest rose into a vase by the window, watching the rain ripple against the glass, she understood the cruel clarity of her situation. The world outside demanded propriety, demanded restraint, demanded silence, but within the secret folds of her heart, a fire had been kindled, fanned by tokens, rumors, and stolen confidences. And though the path forward was shadowed with peril, she could not deny the thrill that coursed through her. The Duke's game had begun, and she, willingly or not, was drawn inexorably into its perilous, intoxicating orbit. "I have watched you from the edges of every crowd, and I cannot turn away." The night arrived like a velvet curtain, heavy with rain and the hushed whispers of London streets. Inside the Duke's private library, the air was warm with the scent of burning oak and aged parchment, and the flicker of candlelight cast shadows that danced across the walls, as though the room itself conspired to conceal their presence from the prying eyes of the world. She entered with measured composure, yet beneath the surface her pulse quickened, each step carrying the weight of expectation and the tremor of apprehension. He was already there, seated in a high-backed chair, the firelight painting his features in stark relief, strong jaw, dark eyes, and an expression that was both commanding and weary. The moment she crossed the threshold, the room seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them suspended in a fragile bubble of silence. "You came," he said, voice low and deliberate, carrying the weight of authority yet tinged with something almost tender. She inclined her head, resisting the instinct to let her hands betray her nervousness. I would not keep you waiting, sir. He studied her in quiet intensity, his gaze cutting through the layers of decorum she had so carefully constructed. Do you know why I sent for you? His question was not idle, it demanded honesty, demanded courage. She could feel the gravity of his expectation pressing upon her chest. I can only guess, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. And yet I fear that my guess would be insufficient to your meaning. A faint smile touched his lips, the first human softness she had glimpsed in the formidable figure before her. It is simpler than you imagine, and yet far more complicated. He rose, crossing the space between them with the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to command. Each step seemed to echo through the library, a drumbeat of inevitability. I have watched you, always with care, always at a distance. I see your courage, your dignity, even when the world conspires to strip them from you. And yet, I find I cannot turn away. Her breath caught, a delicate tremor that betrayed her composed exterior. She had feared this moment, longed for it, and yet the raw honesty of his confession rendered her almost speechless. You watch me, she murmured, uncertainty and wonder mingling in her tone. Yes, he said, near enough now that she could see the subtle tension of his hand resting on the edge of the desk, yet not close enough to touch. I watch not to possess, but to understand. To protect, when the world proves cruel. And, if I am honest, because I have come to care more deeply than propriety, than reputation, than even I can admit aloud. A tremor of warmth spread through her, equal parts fear and longing. She had guarded her heart against the subtle tyranny of society, had measured every word, every gesture, yet here stood a man who laid bare his feelings with a candor that left no room for pretense. And still, the shadow of doubt lingered. If the world knew, if the whispers reached beyond the walls of this sanctuary, could they survive? I do not know what to say, she confessed, her voice small yet resolute. The world would not understand. Even the Duke, who is admired and feared alike, is bound by eyes that scrutinize and judge. He inclined his head, understanding etched in every line of his face. Then we shall keep this between us, for now. Let the world rage with its petty judgments. In here, he gestured subtly to the candlelit room, the fire casting them in private intimacy, we speak only truth. And truth, miss, is a currency more precious than gold. Her heart thudded, a wild, erratic rhythm that seemed almost too loud in the hushed library. Slowly, carefully, she stepped closer, closing the distance without breaking propriety. And what is the truth you wish me to hear, sir? He inclined closer, voice dropping to a level that made the world outside disappear entirely. That I admire you more than decorum allows. That I find in you a courage I cannot ignore, and a grace I cannot resist. And, though I would demand nothing of you, I hope that perhaps, in time, you might permit me to prove that my intentions are sincere. Her breath caught, a delicate sigh escaping before she could control it. She had always measured her life by society's exacting standards, yet here was a man who defied all such rules, offering something infinitely more dangerous, the promise of unguarded, unjudged affection. For a moment, the rain tapping against the window seemed to fall more softly, the world outside reduced to a distant murmur. She dared a step closer, the faintest brush of her glove against his hand, a gesture both bold and respectful. The electricity of it was undeniable, a promise and a question entwined. And if I were to accept this truth, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear, what then becomes of our lives in a world that would see us undone? His gaze softened, dark eyes luminous in the firelight. Then, miss, we endure together. Not recklessly, not without care, but with courage. For the heart is rarely granted the luxury of patience, yet when it calls, it must be heard. The room fell into a quiet that was almost sacred, the library holding its breath along with them. In that fragile space, between firelight and shadow, confession and acknowledgement, they glimpsed a path forward, a road fraught with peril, yet rich with the promise of something neither had dared to name openly until now. And as the storm outside continued its relentless rhythm, she realized that the delicate tension of their connection, once constrained by propriety and rumor, had shifted irrevocably. In the intimacy of whispered truths, they had discovered a bond neither society nor circumstance could easily sever, and the game of heart and reputation, once so measured and precise, had taken a turn into dangerous, intoxicating territory. Sit beside me, as my fiancée, but know this, one rule binds us, and I shall not break it. The spring evening fell like a velvet cloak over London, the sky bruised in purple and amber as the last rays of sun spilled across the cobblestones. Within the grandeur of Ashbourne House, the ballroom shimmered with anticipation, Crystal chandeliers reflected the flickering light of 1,000 candles, and the scent of roses and wax mingled in the heavy air. Whispers moved like currents, carrying gossip of whispered notes, stolen glances, and the audacity of a duke whose intentions no one dared fully fathom. She stood near the center of the room, a figure of composure framed in pale silk, her posture immaculate though her pulse betrayed her. The weight of expectation pressed upon her. Every eye in the room seemed to measure, judge, and speculate. And yet, above the hum of polite murmurs, one presence eclipsed all else. He approached with the measured precision of a man accustomed to command, his gaze fixed solely upon her. The chatter faded, leaving only the echo of their shared tension in the vast, glittering space. "Miss," his voice cut through the room like a fine blade, polite yet resonant with authority. "You have endured whispers, speculation, and the idle cruelty of society's attention. And still, you stand here with dignity. It is time the world acknowledged the truth between us." A collective breath seemed to hang in the room, the society observers sensing the gravity of the moment even if they could not yet name it. Her pulse raced, caught between anticipation and fear, as the Duke extended his hand, a simple gesture laden with power, intent, and unspoken promise. "Will you," he continued, "sit beside me as my fiancée? Not as a concession to gossip, not as a shield against scandal, but as a declaration of what we have quietly nurtured, beyond the eyes of the world." The question, so daring in its public audacity, sent a ripple through the assembly. Some gasped, others murmured incredulously, and yet all eyes were riveted to her. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the tension of propriety pressing against the fire of desire. Every fiber of her being demanded caution, yet the courage he had invoked within her in private whispered that this was the moment to act. She lifted her chin, her voice steady though soft. "If I am to sit beside you, sir, it shall be as an equal, acknowledged by neither fear nor necessity, but by choice. For the world may judge, but my heart answers only to what is true." A hush settled over the room, the weight of her words striking with the clarity of a bell. The Duke's expression softened, and he inclined his head in a subtle acknowledgment of her courage. The rule he had spoken of, the one she had dreaded, remained unbroken: trust, respect, and the promise of honesty above all else. And in that constraint, she saw freedom, the liberty to love without the compromises society demanded, to claim a bond forged in mutual admiration and unspoken understanding. He offered his arm, and she placed her gloved hand upon it with deliberate care, a public act that carried the weight of private vows. Together, they moved across the ballroom, their steps measured and poised, yet each glance, each subtle touch, communicated the intimacy they had cultivated in secrecy. The whispers of the assembly persisted, but they no longer pierced. They were background to the rhythm of connection, to the quiet triumph of two hearts defying expectation without defying propriety. The evening reached its apex as the orchestra swelled for the waltz. Hands entwined, they moved with a grace that drew every eye, yet seemed untouched by scrutiny. It was a dance of power and surrender, of restraint and revelation, a living declaration that neither society's judgment nor scandal's whisper could unravel. In that movement, they found resolution, her dignity intact, his devotion unflinching, and their bond acknowledged with courage, elegance, and a fire that burned brighter than any chandelier above. And as the final strains of music lingered in the gilded air, she understood fully what had shifted. The Duke's one rule, the safeguard she had feared, had not confined her, it had liberated her. In choosing trust, in claiming love under scrutiny, they had transformed scandal into triumph, whisper into promise, and longing into undeniable reality. The crowd could speculate, society could mutter, but in the quiet beat of their joined hearts, the world's judgment had no power. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a private smile, a spark of hope that no murmur, no glance of envy, no delicate scandal could extinguish. And in that smile, he saw not only her beauty and courage but the confirmation of a truth long cherished, that love, tempered by respect and courage, could indeed claim victory over every shadow of doubt. "No whisper, no glance, no rule shall keep me from you, if you will let me try." The night air carried the scent of rain-dampened cobblestones as they stepped into the garden of Ashbourne House, where lanterns swung gently in the breeze, casting pools of golden light upon the wet grass. The city beyond was a muted murmur, distant and inconsequential, while within the confines of this secreted sanctuary, the world narrowed to two figures poised at the precipice of revelation. Her gown, pale as moonlight, clung to her with delicate elegance, the satin whispering with every measured step. His dark coat, immaculately tailored, seemed to absorb the lantern glow, emphasizing the rigid perfection of his posture yet failing to conceal the subtle tension in his shoulders. "I feared," she admitted, her voice low, quivering with the weight of months of restraint, that the world would never allow us peace. That gossip, envy, and expectation would forever keep us apart. He stepped closer, the gravel crunching softly beneath his polished boots, and lifted a gloved hand to gently brush a stray curl from her face. "Let them talk," he said, the authority in his tone tempered with an almost tender insistence. "The world may cast stones, but it cannot undo what is true between us. Our hearts, miss, are beyond their reach." Her chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, every nerve alive to his presence. The air between them seemed to thrum, charged with a tension that had grown slowly, deliberately, over countless stolen moments, glances in crowded halls, notes left unobserved, and words whispered in shadows. Yet here, beneath the lanterns and the delicate veil of rain, the culmination of their hidden understanding hung in perfect balance. I do not know if I have courage enough," she confessed, voice almost swallowed by the night, "to stand, openly, with you against the world's scrutiny." His eyes softened, dark and resolute, as he closed the distance between them. "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. You have shown it at every turn, in ways they cannot see. Now, let us act together, and leave judgment to those unworthy of our concern." A silence fell, profound and absolute, broken only by the distant drip of rain from lanterns and the gentle rustle of leaves. She lifted her gloved hand, placing it tentatively against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the dark fabric. In that singular contact, the fragile boundary between propriety and desire seemed to dissolve, leaving only trust, recognition, and the raw pulse of human connection. "Then you will allow this declaration?" she asked, a tremor of hope woven through her restraint. "I will," he affirmed, voice low yet unwavering. "And more than a declaration, it is a promise. Not to change you, nor to command you, but to stand with you, as equals, as partners, as something stronger than the idle murmurs of society could ever threaten." The tension that had built over months, the stolen tokens, the whispered confessions, the quiet confrontations with rumor and envy, now unraveled in a single, luminous moment. They stepped closer still, shoulders brushing, breaths mingling, the electric intimacy of proximity leaving them both acutely aware of their shared desire and mutual respect. No words were necessary, the promise in his eyes and the courage in hers spoke volumes. A distant chime of the estate's clock heralded the hour, yet they remained suspended outside time, outside expectation. In the quiet brilliance of lantern light, he offered his arm once more, not as a symbol of possession, but of partnership. She placed her hand upon it with deliberate grace, allowing herself to feel the unspoken triumph of trust finally realized. Together, they walked along the garden path, each step measured, yet liberated, proof that devotion, tempered by courage and respect, could conquer the rigid strictures of society. As they reached the marble fountain at the garden's center, she turned to him, her eyes luminous with the mingling of fear and exhilaration. "Then this, us, it is real. Beyond rumor, beyond expectation." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss upon her glove, the gesture intimate and reverent. "It is real," he said, voice firm, eyes unwavering. "And it shall remain so, regardless of the world's judgment. For no scandal, no whisper, no expectation can undo the bond we have forged in truth, trust, and affection." The rain softened to a mist, the lanterns reflected in puddles like twin stars upon the ground, and in that luminous, suspended moment, the fragile tension of months found its resolution. They stood together, poised between shadow and light, scandal and devotion, and she realized with a quiet, exultant clarity that the world, harsh, exacting, and unrelenting, could do nothing to diminish what had been carefully, courageously claimed. A faint smile curved her lips, mirrored by the faintest of approving nods from him. And as the mist curled around their ankles and the distant city sighed beneath the rain, she understood fully. The trials of rumor, the sting of gossip, and the weight of expectation had been rendered powerless by the singular, unyielding truth between them. In that final, luminous instant, their hearts aligned, unguarded and unbroken, and the story that had begun with whispers, scandal, and longing found its thrilling, satisfying culmination. They were together, not by circumstance, not by compulsion, but by choice, courage, and the enduring, undeniable strength of love.